Getting close to the end on Friday, so let's have a little fun, hopefully. Before I get started, let me just tell you that my number one and probably my only goal for this talk is to rewire your thinking just a little bit. Have you share my sickness just a little, okay? Yeah, you know what? This has got internet contagion, so it doesn't matter how far away you are. But yeah, a little distance is probably a good thing. I think you'll see that there's going to be, I'm not even really sure where this presentation is going to go. There's a lot of audience choice in where we end up. But for the first, 15 minutes, I'm going to tell you what this rewired thinking is about. Sort of share a secret that I've discovered, and that I tell that anybody I can get to sit still and listen. So, what is dark matter? I've got a few different definitions here for you. So first of all is the one from astronomy, the one that physicists talk about. And basically, something like 90% of the matter in the universe by mass, or by weight, if you think of it that way for a moment, is something that we can't see. We don't even know what it is. There's something out there that makes up 90% of the universe, and we have no idea what it is because it doesn't reflect light, doesn't emit light, can't see it, can't touch it. I actually met a scientist the other day who looks like Jeff Bridges from The Big Lebowski, and he's one of the scientists actively hunting dark matter right now. So it's pretty funny to run into him about a week before I was giving a talk called Dark Matter. So this is the scientific definition, and does anyone know who was sort of the first scientist to talk about dark matter? Hawking? Stephen Hawking? No, not Stephen Hawking, although there is a story behind that as well. We'll get back to Stephen Hawking, actually. No, I'm thinking about George Lucas. There's a lot of parallels between the critical theme in his movies until he got into the midichlorians. Later on in that second set of movies. It seems like he was reading some 1970s physics and sort of Eastern religion type of thing that all came together into the force. But it seems a lot like dark matter. That just occurred to me basically last week when I was putting this together. But the third and most relevant definition of dark matter is how I use it as a metaphor. And I use this as a metaphor all the time. I don't go 36 hours without describing something as dark matter. So I'll give you an example. When I'm sitting on the couch and my wife is irritated at me for not having walked the dog today, not yet, I'm sitting there going, and she's really disproportionately irritated about something small like the dog. It turns out she's actually irritated at me because I'm watching the Final Four basketball tournament and I'm not paying attention to her. See, there's dark matter in that situation as well. 90% of the problem that she and I are having is one that's not being talked about or recognized, and it takes a little detective work, a little sleuthing to figure that out. Okay? So anything that we can't see, that we don't really pay attention to, but is the majority of what's going on, is something that I will immediately slap the dark matter tag on as a parallel, an analogy. And this is just how I communicate. I don't make it 10 sentences in a row without some sort of metaphor, comparison, analogy, something like that. All right, so let's talk about the first example of dark matter that is relevant to this whole space that we call analytics. Okay, so all these buzzwords that we talk about. So at one point in time, business intelligence was a brand new buzz phrase, and it was the hot thing to talk about. Now it's kind of part of the traditional fabric of the world, and it's kind of lost some of that new edge vibe to it, but it's still something big, powerful, influential. And then we have things like data mining. Data mining, at least in my own personal experience, data mining is something that I kind of discovered after I discovered business intelligence. And then more recently, we've got things like agile and self-serve business intelligence, another great buzzword, predictive analytics, which is kind of taking the place in some ways of how we talked about data mining in the past. All these terms and all these fields of study and fields of expertise that we feel like we have to keep up with, and you know, some of us do. Now, most recently, big data, sentiment analysis, data science. This is the new stuff. This is the new hot stuff, and there's a lot of real fire, real material behind all of that. It's not just a buzz phrase. It's not just hype. But the thing that I want to, this is the first place where I try to rewire your brain just a little bit, is that if you zoom back and you look at the whole world, the whole universe of all of this, and you really start paying attention, these things are kind of small, actually, relative to this backdrop. Something much bigger going on behind the scenes of all of this. That is, again, the vast majority of what's going on in this analytics and reporting space. All this notion of taking data and making sense of it. If you take that universe, by the way, Stephen Hawking that came up earlier, he actually has theorized that the universe is a cellular automata made up of little tiny cells with rules related to how they relate to the cells next to it and adjacent to it and all that kind of stuff. Stephen Hawking believes that there is a grid underneath the universe, and there is a grid underneath our analytics universe. Okay? It's the Excel grid. Excel is the thing, and this is somewhat a controversial statement, but at the same time, so completely mundane. What I'm saying is that some greater than 90%, I can tick people off and say it's 99%, or I can be a little bit more diplomatic and say 95% of all of the data crunching in the world, taking data and turning it into actionable insight, 90+% of that flows through Excel. We don't talk about it very much because it's not very sexy, the notion of using spreadsheets to do this kind of thing. And also there's not a lot of money in it, not even for Microsoft. Think about the price of Excel over the course of the 2 or 3 years that you own a particular version of it and how much you use it every day. It's pennies per day at most. Whereas these other things we're talking about can make lots and lots of money for a single engagement. Okay? So we don't talk about Excel because it's been around forever. We don't talk about it because there's not a lot of money in it. And we don't talk about it because, well, it's just not all that hot, is it? But it's everywhere. Does anyone think that I'm just completely off my rocker here? This would be a good place to have it out. Because I have the microphone, right? Okay, so everywhere I've been in my career, I run into people taking Excel and using Excel to produce insights and then share it with their work group. That's everywhere, at big organizations, small organizations. I've been told off the record by executives of business intelligence firms that they do all of their internal reporting in Excel, even though they're in the business of producing tools to do exactly that. That doesn't surprise me. So why? Why is that happening? This is sort of the second piece of rewiring. Excel is, especially in the IT circles, not so much recently, but certainly over the last 15 years. Excel is feared, hated, reviled, maligned, underestimated. It doesn't have, it's not the kind of thing, again, for some of the same reasons I mentioned before. There's been an active campaign in many enterprise-level organizations to try to stamp out Excel, replace it with something else. And those efforts have universally met with failure. In fact, in more recent years, I've been listening to the talking to IT professionals and hearing more of a coming around. Like, yeah, we've been trying to kill it for years, but we've decided that, A, it's not killable, and B, we're starting to learn to work with it rather than against it. And that's, to me, a very positive thing. But why has Excel been like the Rasputin of the data analysis world? Why has it not been killable? So I didn't realize this. I worked at Microsoft for 14 years. I worked mostly on Excel, and I worked on Power Pivot. And I didn't know the answer to this until probably 18 months after I left Microsoft. And it was just a huge moment. It changed my life forever. I haven't been the same since. So you have this notion of subject matter experts. So within a business unit or an organization, someone that's sort of directly involved with kind of the operation of the business. In other words, not an IT person, a knowledge worker that's not in IT. They know that business very well. There's a tremendous amount of subtlety and just lingo, business rules in an organization that take a very long time to absorb. And then an even more difficult process would be to communicate those to someone else. So someone might spend years immersed in an organization, working as part of that organization, and maybe even defining some of the culture and some of the rules and some of the lingo. And we tend to underestimate, those subject matter experts tend to underestimate dramatically how much they know about their business, because it's just something that they live with. They don't see it, they don't touch it. That's kind of another flavor of dark matter. So when they have a business problem that requires crunching data, they kind of have a choice. They can do it themselves or they can get some help. And if they get some help, it typically takes the form of someone who's really good at a tool set. They're a BI expert. They're an analytics expert. They're an expert in Stephen Levitt's favorite software, SAS, if you heard that question this morning, which was just cracked me up. So when you have this tools expert, they, instead of the past several years spent in the business learning the business language, the business lingo, and all the rules of the business, they've spent that same number of years, if not more, learning some technical tools and getting really good at those. And again, really deep, really rich. And together, the two of them are going to have to pull this thing off. They're going to have to work together to produce a model or a series of reports or an application or something, whatever, that answers the questions that the subject matter expert has. The problem is that the communication between those two people is incredibly expensive, incredibly slow, incredibly error-prone. Taking the contents of my brain and putting those into your brain, or vice versa, is an incredibly difficult process. We don't have, sync cables. We have to use words, and we don't even understand what we understand. So don't take this pie chart to be to scale. But all of the things that go into communication. So gathering requirements, that's communication. The technical person has to ask questions of the business unit. What do we need built? Second phase, discovering that the requirements that you just gathered are completely broken. The person who was giving you the requirements didn't actually describe the requirements to you accurately at all, because again, they've got this picture in their head, and they're using words, and they're seeing that picture the whole time. And they don't realize that when they're saying those words, you're getting a different picture in your head. Or they might not even realize that the picture in their head isn't going to work for them when they eventually get it. This is just human nature, okay? And on the flip side, the person being described to, the person collecting the requirements, is sort of implementing their own filter, their own interpretation over all of this. So there's just a tremendous lack of precision and completeness in this process. So we correct the requirements. It took a long time to discover that we weren't on the same page. Now we have to go and fix them. And then we repeat that a couple times, because trust me, that doesn't just happen once. That's an iterative process. Then we find bugs in the implementation. And then when we find the bugs, we have to discuss how to fix those, because oftentimes it's not enough for the business unit to say, hey, that number that you showed me is wrong. I need to tell you why it's wrong and what it should be. And that takes a lot of time out of both of our schedules. So the majority of the time spent on implementing a project, and this isn't just BI, this is what it's like to develop software, this is what it's like to basically do anything when you have tool set in one brain and business needs in the other brain. You've got very, very little time spent typing the right stuff. Like the code that this analytics expert types that ultimately sticks, if they could just sit down and just type that immediately, the project would be over maybe in a couple of hours. But it doesn't work that way. It's all about communication. Now the flip side is, I can choose to do it myself in Excel as the business person. That's a tool I already understand. So now I have a tool set. Hey, it might not be the strongest tool set in the world. It has limitations relative to other tool sets. But it's one that I know. And when I do that, the communication with myself is entirely much more efficient than communicating with another human being. I like to say that I communicate with myself at like broadband or fiber speed, and I communicate with other human beings at 2400 baud modem speed at best. So I can move really quickly. And this right here, I promise you, to the extent that I'm a credible authority on this, this is why Excel hasn't gone anywhere. It's because of the communication cost of other projects. And if it's not that Excel is like this superb analysis tool. It is actually, but it's mostly the fact that the business unit already knows it. That's the trick. They know it, so they don't have to communicate. They can just go and execute. And that's why Excel never goes anywhere. Any questions about that? That's a really important concept. And again, I did not know this when I worked at Microsoft. I worked on the Excel team for years and never had any idea this was what was going on. Never looked at it this deeply. Okay. So the joke here is that if you're Spock, you don't need Excel, right? Because you can just communicate super efficiently. They have the download link. They can actually find out what's in the other person's head. You know, maybe are we not a Star Trek crowd? I thought this was an analytics conference. Okay. And the last sort of thing that's happening kind of under the radar is that, by the way, you know how hard it is to find a picture of a race car that's sponsored by Microsoft? There'd be 15 more slides if it weren't for that picture. Anyway, so the Excel analysis tool has always been, you know, like I said in the last slide, it's always been very fast. But something different, and you know, I'm sorry guys, it's another Star Trek metaphor, okay? Who knows what that is and is willing to say it? It's the warp engine, yes, okay? So what Microsoft has done when no one was looking, of course I was part of this, and Ron was part of this, and Olivier was part of this. So a few of us were looking because we were part of it. But while the world slept, Microsoft went and took an absolute warp drive engine and transplanted it into the Excel race car. Okay? And we are just now beginning to feel the first ripples of what that's going to do to the world. And it's going to have much more impact, in my opinion, than almost anything else we talk about at the rest of the conference. Because the number of people who know Excel and know it really well, like the experts at Excel, conservatively numbers at 30 million people. And that basically, if you take all of the developer audiences in the world and start adding them up, like the Java developers and the SQL developers, you're very, very hard pressed to reach 30 million when you start to add all of the developers together. By far, Excel has the broadest user base of expert users of any sort of programming / analysis type tool in the world. It's not even close. And if we're going to revolutionize their tool set, we're going to change the world, and it's going to happen in a way that no one's really expecting. So let's talk about two results of this transplanted engine and how this is going to affect the world. So the way that Microsoft officially talks about this is primarily under the auspices of self-service BI. Okay? So if we think about these people at the top of this mountain, they're like BI practitioners. And this, within an organization, BI is very centralized. It's a very top-down, typically, type of operation. And it involves very few people relative to the numbers of people that ultimately are to be informed by it. And self-serve BI, we can think of it as being, hey, let's take that and let's democratize it a little bit. Let's involve a slightly larger audience in the production of our reports, in the production of our models. So we're going to climb down this mountain a little bit. Okay? And this is what is happening that is being talked about. So if you read like the analysts, all the industry analysts, and what they're talking about, this is what they're talking about. When they talk about Power Pivot and things like that, self-serve BI, This is the trend that they're talking about. And this is an important trend. I'm not going to say that this is insignificant. But there's something else that's happening as well that very few people are talking about. And that is that further down the mountain are all of these Excel people that outnumber the sort of the centralized BI pros conservatively 1,000 to 1, okay? And they have access to this same improved tool set, that transplanted engine thing, okay? And so I call this more of the Excel plus trend. So these are people from the Excel world climbing the mountain. And they might end up in a similar place in terms of what they're able to do as the self-serve BI trend. But think about the number of people involved here in this second trend. And again, it's happening in a place that is typically not generating a ton of money for consultants at the moment. Right? It's not generating a ton of additional software sales. It's not generating a lot of analyst interest because there aren't really any spreadsheet analysts left alive. Right? That's sort of an extinct breed. You have to be an analytics or business intelligence or big data sort of analyst. And so you're going to be focused primarily on that top trend. So this tsunami is coming. And I've been watching, for instance, the readership of my blog over the past 3.5 years. I've got a blog, Power Pivot Pro. It's dedicated completely to Power Pivot. And when I first launched the blog, basically, if you were in the Microsoft business intelligence industry, you were being just beaten over the head with Power Pivot messaging, for the past 3.5 years. And it was really hard for you to miss it, that Power Pivot was going on. And so if you were the kind of person to read a blog and you liked my blog, you decided pretty quickly to read my blog or not. And that was pretty flat for like 1.5 years. Since then, though, the Excel people have been coming in, and the Excel people are now like 75, 80, maybe even 90% of the people reading my blog. At the beginning of my blog, I was talking about BI. Now I just talk about Excel. That's a huge shift. And it continues. Okay, so 3 kinds of dark matter. They're all related, and they're all really important. So, hey, look, see, I was the non-diplomatic flavor here, the 99%. It is the dominant tool, but only because of the communication barrier. It's not a dominant tool because it's a better tool necessarily. It's a good tool, but it's not winning on technical merit or even on feature set. It's winning by the fact that the subject matter experts have a tool where they can get it done without having to communicate. And number 3 is this army of 30 million Excel pros. And when I say Excel pro, this is my definition of it. If you are able to create pivot tables, and you do create pivot tables, that's the Excel pro. That's sort of like the bellwether, the hallmark of an Excel pro. And from instrumentation data and things like that, back when I worked at Microsoft, I can tell you that this audience is approximately 30 million people in the world, and they're everywhere. It's like scattered like a dust all over the world. And they're now waking up to this tool set. Okay, any questions on those 3? Because really, that's the primary thrust of what I'm trying to get across. Yes?
Well, I say the other big, huge thing is it's already paid for.
That's true.
The company already owns the tool, you don't have to pay extra for it.
Yes, Excel is already paid for. It's already on your desktop. That has a lot to do with why you already know it as well. But I mean, once a tool is paid for, I've seen plenty of BI tools that are paid for and put in front of users, and they still don't really want to learn it. They want to stick with the thing that's familiar. There are other advantages of Excel I could get into, which is that like Excel is a composable canvas, but that's another talk. That's a full hour right there, I think. Yes?
There are 30 million Excel pros out there. How many Excel users are there out there?
That's really tricky. How many Excel users are out there? So there's a couple of different ways to answer that. First of all, like we never knew when I was at Microsoft a really precise, an answer that we really believed. So the number we used to say was about 300 million. But that was years ago. I don't know if that number's been changed, increased, whatever. And the way we define user was someone who actually did something in Excel other than just open it and look at something. Like someone who read an Excel report, we didn't really consider them to be an Excel user. They had to click something. You know, even the simplest feature, like sort, okay, that would have counted. But there's another way that I've done this is that I've surveyed the Excel pros themselves, because their role is essentially to take data in and produce reports and then share them with their work group. And I've surveyed them as to how many people are consuming their reports. And that's really interesting. I get an average, really the median is 15. 15 consumers for each Excel Pro author. Now the average is higher, because there's people in the data set which have thousands of people consuming their reports. So let's ignore the average, and let's just stick with the median for a moment.
And that's been my experience, is that, 99% of Excel users use maybe 1% of the functionality of Excel. So while it's easy to say that Excel is, everybody's comfortable with Excel, the truth of the matter is they're not. They don't know what they don't know.
That's right. And so the person producing the Excel report, their expertise is in some sense a leveraged asset for the organization, because 15 people benefit from it without having to be that good at Excel. And this is really why these people exist in a way. Like Stephen Levitt this morning talking about how the lack of people who are curious about and able to work with data is like one of the greatest shortages in the world right now. And I've heard this from my scientist neighbor as well. He says, more than anything else, I want people to be data curious, and the rest of the science stuff can follow. But I think the ratio, we know the ratio. There's 1 in 16 people who are data curious, because they didn't train up to be Excel people. They have other job titles. They just became good at it. They just kind of gravitated towards it. They were in some sense battlefield promoted into this position, although it isn't much of a promotion typically, unfortunately. We're working to change that. Yes?
So I think it's also segue from what you just said, an idea that I want to propose. I think we're in the powerful generation. I think the people that are getting Excel and getting this data are moving from just looking at how an individual player plays ball to how the team interacts to win a game or to win a series. And I'm a consultant myself, and you said before, consultants don't really like this. And I would counter and say that actually I do like this because it changes the tenor of the question.
Yeah.
Business intelligence is becoming transparent, and users are now looking through the tool at the data underneath.
Yes.
And having a tool like this is like shining a great halogen spotlight on that data, and suddenly you find that the data is not as good as you want it to be. And so that's where I step in and say, I can help you with that. So I actually like Excel. I love this because the argument is no longer about picking your BI vendor. It's about dealing with the real issues, which are really, in many cases, not even technology issues.
Yeah, and let me just summarize that, because I actually agree with you. I personally believe that this power pivot revolution is also going to be very, very, very good for consultants, especially the consultants who recognize that this is what's coming and adapt the way that they pitch and the way that the nature of the services that they sell. The ones who sort of are more frightened of it and try to deny it, those are the ones that are going to be in trouble with it. And it's one of the things that I've got in sort of my Jeopardy board of demos and topics that you'll see here in a second. Just so you don't think that the presentation's over or anything. But we're going to do, here, I'll come back to this in a second. But I've got a Jeopardy Topics grid. We get to pick and choose what we talk about. But I'll come back and explain why we're doing that. And then one last point about the 15, median of 15 consumers for every author. That adds up to be about 500 million human beings consuming and participating in this Excel intelligence world on an ongoing basis. 500 million is a really big number, okay? And I run into the authors on airplanes all the time. They just don't typically advertise themselves as being Excel authors, because that's not their job title. Okay, so like I said, we're going to get into free-form Q&A, but also lots of pre-prepared topics you can pick from, demos and discussion points. But just to give you an idea really quickly of who I am, rather than doing this at the beginning. So yeah, about 13 and a half years at Microsoft on Excel. I just did 3 years as CTO of a company called PivotStream, Did a lot of Power Pivot stuff, a lot of hosted Power Pivot stuff there. That company is 100%, one way or another, making all their money off of Power Pivot, and has been for a very long time. And then Power Pivot Pro is my blog, powerpivotpro.com. I've also written a book that the people who've read it have really liked it, but we'll come back to that. So, the last conference I did was the SharePoint conference in Las Vegas in, I think, November. And I remember the SharePoint conference from a few years earlier. It was all business people. Business people. It wasn't IT pros so much, and it definitely wasn't BI pros. So I prepared this great talk geared at the business audience, and then I got in the room, and I just sort of did this informal poll of who everybody was, and basically everyone in the room was a BI pro. And I knew right then that my presentation was going to suck, okay? It was not going to be good. So this is the first ever PASS Analytics, Business Analytics Conference. So I wasn't going to get burned by this, okay? Right? I have no idea what this conference is like yet. I have no idea, I think there's a tremendous mix of backgrounds here. So rather than build a very static presentation and take the risk that I picked the wrong numbers in the lottery, we're going to do this instead with our remaining time. So let me read you some topics here, okay? We're going to pick from this topics board. People can raise their hands, jump in, etc. I'll also take questions that are off the board if you want, but questions on the board certainly have a preference for me because I put so much time in preparing my answers. All right, so 1,000 miles of data, budget versus actual, self-propelled teams, funless slicers. I don't have a good Alex Trebek voice, so. Weather impact on sales, UFOs and drug use, rats sniffing butts for science, deputizing Excel pros. I need to put a longer delay between these. Alien abduction calendar. I couldn't even read them all to you in time. And I'm not going to use PowerPoint to do this. Of course, I'm going to use Excel. So we have the same board in Excel. I think first hand was over here.
Yeah, one of the things that I find very interesting and actually difficult to build, I'm a director and been using Power Pivot since 2009. And Power Pivot is, in my opinion, a completely different animal than Excel. A much more nuanced tool in some ways. So I'd love to hear your opinion about how we can develop people that are Excel pros being led over different tables. And how we can get them to understand the calculus and summarize and all that great stuff to kind of get them to the level we need.
So the question is, we have these Excel pros, but Power Pivot is a different animal. It's like 15 years of features delivered all at once. It really is, because that's how old the underlying product was. How do we train people up and get them competent with it? Because it is a different way of thinking, isn't it? And with questions like this, I must resist as much as possible the urge to get really commercial here. So I'll do it. A couple things. So that's one of the things that I've been doing a lot of is training people like that, the Excel pros. But I always make sure to have the data team in the room. It turns out that Excel people, they need to learn in a very Excel fashion. And I spent a lot, I've got a whole separate slide deck on this, but there's essentially like a smooth curve to how you learn Excel. You learn incrementally, little bits and pieces at a time, and you're always able to get something good done, but you're slowly getting better without even really knowing it. Whereas the average development tool requires this first big, huge investment just to learn enough to be dangerous, and then you can kind of trend up after that, but there's this big wall to climb at the beginning. And this is why Excel is kind of something that business users have been able to embrace. And teaching Power Pivot kind of needs to respect that they're not going to learn all of it all at once. You start off just teaching the really simple stuff, like just show them, like, first of all, this gets rid of VLOOKUP. I can link multiple tables together like that and do a quick analysis. In a way, like if Microsoft, that's all we had done in Power Pivot was to let you link tables together that quickly, that might have been a good enough product. for a long time, you know? But it's like, okay, now there's another product, another 4 years of development on top of that, of a massive software stuff. You can do X, Y, and Z. It's just too much, in a way. It's one of the biggest problems with Power Pivot is it's actually way too deep for someone to digest. Like you look at the functions, I have this thing where I talk about the Power Pivot functions in the formula language need a spicy scale, like what you get at like a Thai restaurant, you know? The names of the functions don't tell you whether they're advanced or not. Calculate sounds pretty advanced, but it's really the basic function, you know? And then things like earlier sound like, hey, that sounds like, it's like, it was a year and a half before I ever used the earlier function and used it effectively. So you kind of need to know the sequence of how you learn is very important. That's the best I can do in a short response. What was the next hand was over here? Let's go with you on the aisle.
On portable formulas,
Yeah.
I think that being a C-sharp type developer or falling and stumbling to the not being able to take little formula logic and have it apply a bunch of different places.
Yeah.
To copy it everywhere. But
Yes. Yeah.
I'm
So
hoping that happens.
yeah. Well, first of all, that means that I named portable formulas properly, because that is what it is. So the question is, one of the weaknesses of Excel, I'm going to restate your question. One of the weaknesses of Excel, and it's a tremendous weakness, at least traditionally, has been that your formula logic is tied to the grid of the current report that you're building. So you want to do like a year-over-year growth formula. Well, that's referencing 3 cells up and 1 cell over, okay? But then if you want to go and put like the categories into that report, all of your formulas are broken. And you've got to rebuild the report. It's as much work to change the report as it was to build the report in the first place, especially if it's a sophisticated report. This is one of the things that Power Pivot fixes. This is the only one on my Jeopardy grid that requires me to show something else first before I can show this one. So as soon as I get another workbook open for a demo of some sort, we'll come back and click this one. Okay? Yes?
You went to all this trouble for the board, Rob, so I'm going to ask for alien abduction calendar.
Yes, alien abduction calendar for 300. All right, you're going to see this is super fancy, guys. Ready for this? Watch this drum roll delay, okay, and then a message box. Now remember, you know, I'm an Excel guy, so like if I want to build a Jeopardy app, I'm going to build it in Excel. Okay, so this is fake data, okay? I want to tell you that right up front. And I don't mean just fake in terms of it's UFO data. This is actually fake UFO data. Later on, I might show you some real UFO data later on, depending upon what buttons you click. All right, so this is Excel. You can see that it's Excel by the title bar here. I've turned off the grid lines and the headers, which makes it look a little bit less Excel-like. And these are essentially calendar charts. They're just being rendered in the Excel grid. Those are formulas in every one of those cells and conditional formatting behind it. This is, to this day, this is the most advanced thing I've ever done in Excel. Right? When I finished this, I stepped back and said, oh man, I'm never going to understand this workbook in another week. You know? But the point is, it's just this infinitely flexible canvas. And I can slice, I'm even changing what it's showing me. I want to see late night sightings as opposed to just sightings. And I want to see it just in the second half of the year. And so that January turns into June and July and things like that. Really, really flexible, powerful tool. And this is built using Power Pivot. Okay? So nice quick hitter, good way to start us out. And now you get the idea of what this is going to look like, right? All right, back to Jeopardy. How about 1,000 miles of data in one file? Let's do that one really quick, because that's a big file. All right, so really simple pivot table report here. Nothing terribly fancy going on. Let me zoom a little bit for you. So just have these session numbers. This will tie back into this rat experiment that my neighbor scientist ran. I'll tell you about that later, depending upon which squares we check. So it's just a pivot table. But the thing that's interesting here is that if I go into the Power Pivot window, this workbook, this frequency table has 162 million rows in it. I apologize, I don't have Zoom It installed. But this number at the bottom here is 162 million rows of data that's in this workbook on that one sheet tab. Okay? And it's in an Excel workbook. I know that regular Excel sheets have a 1 million row limit. Power Pivot doesn't really have a fixed limit in terms of rows. That's 162 million rows, and on this second sheet tab I have 141 million rows. So there's over 300 million rows of data in this workbook. And it's running on an Ultrabook, folks, which is a 4 gigabyte RAM machine. It's nothing, this isn't a big workstation type laptop. It was less than $1,000. If I go back to Excel, I change the slicer, you'll see that the report updates in about a second and a half. And this is running, if you see how many sessions here, if I go to the bottom, it's about 18,000 sessions. So there's about a 36,000 cells of aggregate data being calculated against 300 million rows of data and filtered in about a second and a half on what can only be described as commodity hardware. It's just something people have on their desktop for doing email. I write blog posts on this, you know? I use it on the airplane. It's my iPad, okay? And I was asked by someone on an airplane one time, because this is where I meet all of my fellow Excel pros, is on airplanes, nowhere else. So they asked me, if you printed that out, how long would the paper stretch? And if I printed out 300 million rows of data at normal print resolution, it would be about 1,000 miles long of printout. And it would stretch across basically more than half of the eastern seaboard of the country. And every time I make a click on that slicer, you can imagine Power Pivot running up and down that line of data, selecting which rows it wants to include, and then adding them up. Okay? Moore's law might be slowly tapering off in terms of exponential growth and processor speed and all of that, but it certainly got us a long way before it started to get tired. Okay? 1,000 miles data, one workbook.
How big is that workbook about?
It's a little less than a gigabyte, this workbook on disk. I think the original text files that fed this were around 50 gigs. And it compressed down quite nicely, as you can tell. You get different, you're not going to always get 50x compression. It's going to vary a lot based on your data set and how many columns you have. This is a great data set for compression. Yes, Ron? Just-in-time data warehousing. I renamed it data marts here to make people a little less upset. Okay, so this is one where we're going to be in the slides. Oops. Not this one. We want just-in-time data marts. Okay, so this is where we come back around to the consulting thing, and where I have seen a tremendous overlap. So Power Pivot is a great analysis and reporting tool and a modeling tool. It is not a data shaping tool. Microsoft has started to do some things in data shaping for the end user with this thing called Data Explorer, but it's still relative to what you can do in SQL. I would say that the answer is still very much out on that, and it always will be. To make a long story short, I, as a Power Pivot author, so this is kind of funny. So I'm a member of the Microsoft SQL Server MVP community. I'm labeled as a SQL Server MVP, and I don't know SQL at all. Okay? Probably the only one who doesn't know SQL and at least admits it. But I can't write SQL at all, okay? And so when I need a new shape of table to feed into Power Pivot, I need the help of someone who knows that tool set. And guess what I have to do then? I have to communicate. But it turns out that in that situation, when I need to communicate, I can communicate with amazing precision. I can walk into your office and I can draw the table on the board and say, I need this. And usually, the reaction of the database professional at that point is, that's it? It's like they just don't feel any challenge. Like, you're telling me that if I give you that, it's only going to take me 5 minutes. If I give you that, we're going to make the CEO happy with that 5 minutes of work? And I say, yes. And then we do it, and we win. So my advice, and again, I'm not a data warehousing professional. I've been around that world a lot, okay? So don't take this as the gospel or anything like that. But my advice is to, when you're evaluating a project where you're going to be building a data warehouse or building some data marts, to power analysis, don't get hung up on gathering requirements. Don't get hung up on all of that, because you're not going to do a great job anyway, okay? Just get started. Get something in front of someone like me, the Power Pivot author. Give me a simple collection of tables, like star schema type and star schema is really just a name for tables linked, at least in my lingo. It's tables linked together, and it's only one hop. It's not chains, okay? I know that in terms of I was told on Wednesday night that in terms of the official Kimball Bible, when I say star schema, I'm actually implying 18 other things that I don't know about. So I'm not implying those. Really simple, okay? So get that in front of me and tell me, go. I've given you what you need, and you know that you haven't. So I'll go try to make it work, come back to you and say, I need this, this, and this. And you go and you build it, and then I do that. And then we just keep iterating like that. This process is going to go on for a while. It's going to slow down eventually. But in the end, you're going to have built something collaboratively that it far exceeds anything that you would have done in sort of the traditional way, trying to build a big, elaborate data warehouse or data mart and anticipating what it's going to be used for. Because you're going to anticipate needs that actually are never really needs. It's never going to be used. And you're going to miss things that are needs. And just get started and be okay with that. Yes?
I think that this is a great idea.
Here it comes.
I'm a consultant, so we project work with BI, and we are using Agile BI relatively effectively, but we still spend, in my opinion, way too much time up front. And I'm wondering, just to try and get more of my colleagues behind me, are there any case studies or any examples of where this has been effective?
Okay, so that was not what I was expecting you to say. I was expecting you to say, I think this is a great idea, but. Okay, so the question is, assuming for a moment that this is a good idea, how would we sell it to others in the consulting profession or even in like just the BI business in general? And are there any case studies? Well, I have case studies. I can talk at length about my personal experience with it. There is one case study that is it's actually on the Jeopardy board. That's on the Microsoft site, which is something that we did when I was at PivotStream. It doesn't go into this level of depth. You'd have to talk to me to get the color, because I would give, whenever I do a case study with Microsoft, I give them 10 pages of information, and they spit out a 1.5-page result. And it's like all of the really cool stuff has been chopped out by the time it goes through that process. So, but yeah, there are, again, it's my personal experience, but I've probably got 15 projects like this under my belt where they all went the same way. And when I go to train people on Power Pivot, I always make sure that the database team is in the room. This happens every time, everywhere I go. I tell them in advance, at some point during these 2 days, we're going to need some changes in the database. And the DBA team over here is going to go, that's it, and they're going to have it done in 5 minutes, and then we'll get back on our way. And everyone giggles, and then that happens sometime near the end of the first day or early on the second day, without fail. So I mean, it's one of those things where if you want to email me, I'd be happy to give you some ammunition. But I don't think you're going to find, at least not that I'm aware of, like lots of really good up in the sky blessed case studies, at least not yet. All right. Back to, oh, sorry.
How are you getting the data loaded?
How am I getting the data loaded?
You come to a company and you tell them this, and it's an old company, let's say, the
Yeah.
utility, and they've got the CSS data warehouse, which is a mainframe that runs on Oracle. Well, there's all their OLTP stuff. Oh, we want to do a data warehouse. Yeah, we can set this all up, but who's going to move that data? And
Okay, so honestly, I don't yet understand the question precisely enough. So how do I load the data? I've got lots of old legacy systems. And are you saying these are the kinds of legacy systems that don't support any kind of direct connect? Like I can't just connect up to them and pull and run a SQL query, or?
oh no, you can't. You
Okay.
definitely
Well, Power Pivot is a great place for data sources to come together. Like one of the things about, and I can show us another one of the examples, is that in the past, when you had multiple different data sets and you wanted to kind of build a cube from all of them, it was sort of like a prerequisite that all of those data sets kind of had to come together first in some sort of repository that was, data warehouse that was level playing field. And that might have been just something you would do just to power one analysis or one class of analysis. And so it rarely would get done. The ROI wouldn't be there. Power Pivot's great. I can import from SQL over here, and then the internet over here, and some text files over here. And as long as they have common keys, columns that I can match up between them, then Power Pivot doesn't care where it came from. So Power Pivot, within a Power Pivot workbook, you kind of create your own one-off, very analysis-focused data model. And you don't have to do a lot of back-end work to integrate everything first. I don't know if that's an answer or not.
It kind of does. We had some major problems with users understanding how to, and I guess we didn't get it done well on the type 2s, the effective data set.
Yeah, so type 2, again, that's Kimball, right?
I call it a type 2. If PeopleSoft or CSS, you would call it effective date.
Okay, still.
Slowly changing dimensions.
Oh, slowly changing dimension.
Sorry,
So
that would have been my third.
that's another,
My next-
I'm familiar with that term. And just to throw this grenade into the audience, I'm of the opinion that probably 80 to 90% of the slowly changing dimensions in the world never needed to be built. But yeah, already forgot why. So I think you've been raising your hand up front for a while. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say the original portable formulas was interesting.
All right. So portable formulas, everyone wants to see that. Let me bring up budget versus actuals first, because then that'll help me show off portable formulas, okay? All right, so if you don't really spend a lot of time in Excel, one of the things that I'll have to just kind of fill you in on is that the notion of comparing budget versus actuals is really, really difficult in Excel, even more difficult than other things. Because when you have multiple tables of data in Excel, typically the answer is to perform some sort of VLOOKUP, voodoo, and merge things together. But with budget and actuals, so on one hand I have a budget table that has about 2,000 rows in it, and then I have a sales table, if I can find it, sales table with 60,000 rows. They're not at the same granularity. I don't budget at the transaction level, okay? I don't budget to have a transaction on February 3rd that sells 3 of these. I budget to sell so many units of a particular category at a month level. I do a much chunkier budget than my sales data comes in. And this is, for people in the BI industry, it's like, we do this all the time. But for people in Excel, this is really difficult because you can't VLOOKUP these two together and produce something. In Power Pivot, it's very simple to wire these things together and get a single formula in a single pivot table. And there are some formulas behind these, but the resulting formula is very simple. It doesn't look like that sum if index match kind of crazy stuff where the formula is this long that you see some of your Excel friends doing. It's very rational, readable, and I'm not even displaying anywhere in any of my worksheets my sales data or my budget data. I'm just displaying the delta between our plan and our actual in a single pivot table, okay? And I can get this done. I can build this one report in probably about 15 minutes, whereas to build the same report the old way in Excel is hours. But here's the killer. I built this report and said, hey, I just want subcategories. This is really just subcategories. I want subcategories down the rows, and I want years across the top. And then I give it to like my manager or whatever, and my manager tells me, well, that's great, but I kind of wanted to see it another way. I wanted to see it, by month and only 2004 or something like that. And now I just start crying because it's going to be as much work for me to change the report as it was for me to build it in the first place. I'll get that several hour cycle restarts. Except now with Power Pivot, the formula is defined centrally. This measure formula over here in this field list is defined centrally. And if I want to swap things around and just put year down here, the formula keeps working. And I want to bring it over here, the formula keeps working. I can add, I'm just going to start randomly adding fields, and hopefully they all just keep working. Right? So, right, like I just keep adding fields to the pivot, and they just keep everything just keeps working. I also can create a brand new pivot table and start doing things like sales versus budget. And this is, I can use it in a separate pivot table. I don't have to redefine the formula. And that's just telling me that I'm overall minus 2.1%. I can put year on there. And so the formula is completely reusable and adaptable to different contexts. Okay? And when you want to know why these numbers add up to minus 2.1%, that's when you need to buy my book. Okay. So that kind of makes sense on the portable formula front. Like any different report shape you want, and this is one of the more sophisticated examples, like year-over-year growth, like growth since last year. Put it on your pivot table, drag it around, move it around, rearrange it, create different layouts. It doesn't matter. It's going to still work. Yes?
I'm under the impression that there's no way to define your own functions in that.
So,
I was hoping that maybe there was some nugget capability of that.
So the question is, can you define your own functions in DAX? Like, could I write my own UDF to do something like, I don't know, something that Power Pivot doesn't do, like...
Fiscal calendars, 4 or 5.
Those I can do. I can do fiscal calendars to death in Power Pivot. In fact, most calendars in the world are not normal calendars. Most calendars are non-standard calendars, which means that all of the time intelligence functions in DAX are useless, but you can still do it. And there's if you want to just do a Google search for this, Google for greatest formula in the world, okay? I got a series of blog posts in there, and eventually I start abbreviating it GFITW. And I get to write a book. I wrote a book where I get to type greatest formula in the world over and over again. It was awesome. Okay, so can you write UDFs? No. The answer is no. You can't write your own functions. I could imagine maybe, again, without knowing anything, I get to speculate just completely randomly from the outside that it's a lot easier for them to let you do UDFs, to do calculated columns in the Power Pivot window than it would be to write UDFs that would operate in a measure in the pivot table. So I don't know. We have some people from Microsoft in the room, but I'm not going to put them on the spot. Okay. So portable formulas we did. Yes?
Weather impact on sales.
Weather impact on sales. Perfect. Okay, this is a great. Actually, you know what? We're actually out of time, I think. But I'm happy to stick around until they kick me out, okay? All right, so sales of accessories, bikes, and clothing by month, and I can slice by region. Now, this is an old data set. It's AdventureWorks from the ancient world. When I was first looking at this data, I wondered, hey, how do we know if weather is impacting the sales here? Like, I know that it's kind of hot in June, but it's only hot in June in certain areas. I mean, it's not like necessarily Australia is hot in June. So like, I'd have to do a lot of bouncing around here and assume that different places were hot and warm and cold and things like that. Let's just grab the temperature data. So remember, I've imported data from what's essentially a data warehouse to build this sales report, but now I'm grabbing data from the internet. Rob Collie, I went and found this data on the internet from all these different areas of the world and their average temperature by month. I just did a copy. I can go into the Power Pivot window and I can paste that as a new table. So I'm even just doing copy paste. And this will show up as a new sheet tab. And in order to use it, I have to relate it over to my sales table. So I'm just going to do really quickly here. I know that my sales table has a column that is region month ID, name of the region and then a number, okay? My temperature table doesn't have that, but it has the components of it. So I'm just going to write a formula, equals region, and the ampersand operator, month num. I'll rename that like region month with the caps lock key on. Okay, so then I can make a relationship between that and the sales table. Oh, yeah, I need to be kicked out. All right, this is the last thing I want to show. All right, to make that relationship, and now back on the report, I could do something like this. Just clear this off. I won't finish this one, but I'll show you that I can do something like temperature, say average temp. Now I can see it by average temperature. The next steps of the demo, I would have made a column to group these temperature ranges into like cold, hot, warm, and things like that, but I can't be impolite any longer. So, thank you, everybody.